do we have Susan?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, hopefully somebody can. Yes, okay, now we have also the picture. And before we start, may I add that this keynote is brought to us by kind people of Tartu Technology Park. Yes, Susan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And I was just listening a little bit to your last speaker by watching the website. So that's good to kind of be with you. So good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to talk today on Neuro web design, what makes them click. And I want to start by giving you this number, which is 40 billion. So the estimate is that every single second, there are 40 billion inputs coming in to the sensory parts of your brain. So from the things that you're seeing and the things that you're hearing, from the lingering taste of coffee you have, from all the nerve endings as you're sitting in your seat, there are 40 billion inputs coming into your brain every second from your sensory systems. But interestingly, you are only consciously aware of 40 of those at any given time, only 40. So what's happening with all the billions and billions of sensory inputs that you're not consciously aware of? Well, you are processing them, but you're processing them unconsciously. So what we now know is that most mental processing of anything, of everything, occurs unconsciously. Most of our decision-making process is unconscious. And I think this poses an interesting opportunity and an interesting challenge to those of us who are involved in design. And that's what I want to share with you today, is just some ideas about the psychology of the unconscious and how that should affect how you design. Now, what tends to happen is we tend to design for the conscious thinking part of our brain, and we ignore the rest. And we're going to talk about why that may not be a great idea. Now, before I continue, though, I want to mention that I have planned to give away 3 free seats to an online course. So I have a bunch of online courses at udemy.com, and I offered to the conference here that I would give away 3 free seats. And what we're going to do is those are going to be given away to the 3 best tweets during the presentation. That's what your conference organizers decided would be fun to do. And there's a moderator that's actually going to pick which are the 3 best tweets, and therefore who's going to get a seat at the course. So we'll come back to that later, but I just thought that I would mention that. All right, so let's dive right in. And I'm going to talk, as I said, about a number of different things. The first thing I want to talk about is the power of stories. So one thing we know is that people process information unconsciously, and they do a lot of that through stories. And it means that stories capture our attention when we tell stories at a website, for instance. It's going to grab attention. It's going to be interesting. What you may not realize is that there's actually research that shows that when information is presented in story format, it is remembered longer, and it has more of a emotional impact than just presenting data. But there's an even more interesting thing about stories that I want to talk about, which is the unconscious ability stories have to permanently affect our behavior. So I'm going to tell you a story in order to illustrate this. When I first started with computers, which was quite a long time ago, and first got my first computer, it was not an Apple product. So I was a very, the wars between Apple versus PC, and I was a very non-Apple person. I thought Apple computers were for, the artsy visual designing type of people, and that wasn't me. I was a little more geeky than that. So I did not own any Apple products, and I didn't want to own any Apple products. So I had a self-story that I was a non-Apple person. Well, my children, years ago, wanted an iPod. Here's a picture of one of the older iPods, you may remember, and I got them an iPod, and then I decided, well, that's kind of cool, maybe I want one too, and then I said to myself, well, I can't have an iPod because I don't, I'm not an Apple person. But I decided, well, but this, that I'm not an Apple computer person, and an iPod is just an iPod, and so it's okay. So I actually did something I call had a crack in my self-story. What happened next is interesting, because once I had the iPod, then when it came time to get a new smartphone, I ended up buying an iPhone, and then when it came time to buy a laptop, I bought a Mac laptop, and then of course I had to have every Apple product. So over the years, I bought the iPad, the Apple TV, a Nano, a Shuffle, a desktop. How did I go from being I'll never buy an Apple product to owning everything that Apple puts out and not buying any other non-Apple product if there's a choice? Well, it's because by buying that very, very first iPod, I created a crack in my self-story. So we all have stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do. And these are the same stories that we tell other people about who we are and why we do what we do. And if you want people to change their behavior, one of the most powerful things that you can do is get them to crack that persona. We have a need to be consistent. We have these self-personas. We have a need to keep them consistent. But if you get people to take one very small step against that self-persona that's different from the self-story, that can eventually lead to long-term behavior change. There's a wonderful book about this by Timothy Wilson called Redirect, if you're interested in the research behind this. Very strong research that shows that this is true. So one thing you want to think about is what's the one small action that we can ask people to take at our websites or with our product that area. So there's actually a part of the brain that is dedicated to faces. It's dedicated to processing faces. So let's stop for a second and talk about the brain. And I like to refer to the brain as having three parts. I like to talk about the fact that there's a new brain, a midbrain, and the old brain. Now the new brain, if I point to my forehead, that's where it's located, and it's called the new brain because it evolved the most recently. The new brain is the place where the conscious thought is going on. I mentioned before how most of our thought is unconscious, and that's going on in the midbrain and the old brain. Now in the midbrain, that's where social and emotional information is processed. And that's where the fusiform facial area is. So there's actually a large part of the cortex of the brain dedicated to vision, but this part of the brain, the FFA, fusiform facial area, is in the midbrain. It's right next to the amygdala, where social and emotional information is processed.
Susan, there was a call drop. Can you please restart the sharing of the screen?
Okay, hold on. I will do that.
Only seeing your still photo at the moment.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
Yes. Now is your camera. And now we have the desktop.
Okay, so just let me know if that happens again. Hopefully it won't, but we may have to do it a couple of times. Technology doesn't work perfectly. Have you noticed that? Okay, so let me see here. So do you see the picture of the brain?
Yes.
Okay, great. So in the midbrain, we have the fusiform facial area next to the amygdala, and actually there's a connection between the fusiform facial area and the amygdala. And in most of us, in people with autism, that connection doesn't work. So this is why this whole fusiform facial area and the connection with the amygdala, this is why, first of all, when we see a picture of a person, it grabs our attention. That's the fusiform facial area kicking in. And it also means that we can see that it's a person, we can tell whether it's someone we know, and we can read the emotions on their face. And that part is that connection to the amygdala. Now, people with autism, that connection doesn't work. So they see the face, it still grabs their attention, they still know whether it's someone they recognize, but they have a very hard time reading what the person's feeling. But in most people that don't have autism, they can tell that. So pictures have a deep effect on us. So when you include, and we know this, right? When you include pictures, at a website, for instance, it's going to grab attention. It's going to convey emotional information. And I have a series of websites I always like to show. People just get this wrong so much. Here's a college in the U.S., and the person is looking down. They're not looking at the camera, so there's no engagement. Here's another one of the same school. Here's another university. You can't even see the faces because they're so far away, or they're grayed out. This one doesn't have people. It apparently just has squirrels at the University of Arkansas. So these are all missed opportunities to engage. Now here's one from Talon University, and we do have pictures of people, and actually we have some that are looking right at you, but they're kind of small. So you want big pictures, you want people looking right at you if you're going to have the maximum impact. Now you don't want to do what one of my clients did before they worked with me, which is they took this, they combined different faces together. I'm not sure what their point was, maybe that they have a lot of different kind of people at the university. But actually, when people see a picture like this, their reaction is, oh, that's creepy, I don't like that. And that's actually the fusiform facial area kicking in and saying, it kind of looks like a face, but there is something wrong here. So it will grab attention, but then people won't like it. So that's one way then to work with the unconscious is in faces. I want to now talk about something I call tricks of the mind, and I have a chapter by that name in my latest book, How to Get People to Do Stuff. And some of this work is based on some of this material is based on work that Daniel Kahneman did. I don't know if you guys know his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is an excellent book. And he talks about some interesting ways the brain works and some of this unconscious processing. So he makes a distinction between two kinds of thinking, system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking. So for instance, if I show you this and ask you to multiply two numbers together, 17 times 24, and to do it in your head without pen and paper. So if you try and do that for a second, if everyone would just stop and try to multiply 17 times 24 in their head, it's actually kind of hard to do. And that's an example of system 2 thinking. You really have to think about it. You really have to work hard. It's effortful, focused thinking. That's system 2 thinking. And he contrasts that with this. If I show you this picture and I say, what are you looking at? And you'd probably say, well, it looks like a picture of a sad boy, which, by the way, the fusiform facial area is helping you figure that out. And he says that's an example of system 1 thinking. It's very easy, it's very intuitive, you don't have to work hard at it. And his point is that most of the time we walk around doing system 1 thinking, intuitive, easy, effortless, and, by the way, largely unconscious. We're not even aware of the thinking process that we're doing. And this interplay between system 1 and system 2 causes some interesting things. By the way, he says that you can tell when someone is doing system 2 thinking because when they're doing that hard, effortful thinking, their pupils will actually dilate. And so you can even tell when someone is doing that kind of hard thinking. And he gives this example. He says, here's a paragraph, kind of a puzzle that he gives people. In a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half of the lake? 24 days or 47 days? Well, if you answered 24 days, that would be a System 1 quick answer. It's an intuitive answer. Half of 48 is 24. It's actually the wrong answer. 47 days is the right answer. But when he would ask people this question, a lot of people, a lot of the time, would give that quick answer first, and they would say 24 days. But here's an interesting thing. When he gave the same paragraph, but used a font that was hard to read, it's a little more decorative, it's grayed out a little bit, many more people got the answer correct. They got the answer correct when the font was hard to read. How could that be? Well, what he says is that when you encounter something that's hard to read, your normal System 1 easy mode stops. It says, I can't even read this, and kind of turns to System 2 and says, you take over. So it kicks in System 2 thinking, and because of that, then people think more consciously and more carefully, and they get it right. Well, this presents an interesting dilemma to us as user experience people. I mean, are we going to now say that what you should do is make all your fonts hard to read, because then people will think more clearly? Well, I don't know that we're going to say that. But I want you to realize that when things are easy to use, which is what we usually do in usability work, we are kind of encouraging that System 1 intuitive thinking, which a lot of the time works really well. But if you really need someone to stop what they're doing and think very, very carefully about their decision or choice when they're interacting with your website or your software application, you may want to do something to kick them into System 2 thinking, because realize their normal mode is going to be that System 1 intuitive, unconscious, not thinking very hard type of thinking. I think it presents an interesting idea for us. Now, I also want to talk about in this section something called anchoring that you may have heard of. So what happens is if you present a number, any number to someone for any reason, they kind of get set and they anchor on that number. And one of the earliest pieces of research, not even having to do with anything online, has to do with the idea that in a grocery store, if you put up a sign that says there's a sale on soup and there's a limit of 10 cans per person, will people buy more or less soup than if you just say sale on soup and there's no limit mentioned? Well, actually, if you say a limit of 10 cans per person, the average number of cans of soup that people will buy is 7. And if you don't mention a limit at all, the average number of cans that people will buy is 3. That people will actually buy more soup when you mention 10 than if you don't say there's a limit. And that's just because they've anchored randomly on the number 10. This is a very random kind of anchor. You can ask people how many countries are there in the United Nations, and then tell them that there are, make up a number, say there's 212. And that number, 212, will then affect a totally different question that you ask them later. We anchor on a number. So if I'm providing, let's say I have a website and I have 3 levels of some service that I provide. I have the platinum level, which is $55.95, and the gold is $35.95, and the silver is $15.95. Should I present those as with platinum first and then gold and then silver? Or should I present the silver and then the gold and then the platinum? Well, what's going to happen is if you present it this way, the way that it is on top, and you say the platinum is $55.95, the reaction is going to be, oh, well, I don't know, that sounds a little high, and gold is $35.95, that's better, and silver is $15.95, ooh, that's good, I think I'm going to go with the silver. If you switch it around, they're going to say silver is $15.95, oh, that's not bad, gold $35.95, oh, that's getting a little expensive. Platinum, oh, wow, that's way too expensive. There's no way I'm going to do that. So people will actually tend to spend more money if you start with the higher number first, because they've anchored on the higher number. Here's an example at a website here in the U.S., which is does micro lending. They had 3 different donations. You can donate $25, $50, or $75. And actually what's going to happen is people are going to tend to anchor on that first number, 25, and they'll say, well, I guess I'll give 25, 50 maybe, but 75 seems like a lot. So they'd probably get more money in donations if they flipped it the other way and had the $75 first, so people would anchor on that number. Next, I want to talk about instincts. I talked about the brain, I talked about the new brain and the midbrain. Now I want to talk about the old brain. So it's called the old brain because it evolved longest ago. And we share our old brain with amphibians and reptiles. Sometimes it's even called the reptilian brain. And the old brain is constantly scanning the environment. And essentially it's asking. And this is where our instincts are involved. And your old brain is trying to keep you safe, and it reacts really strongly to these three things. It reacts to food, images of food, mentioning of food. It reacts to sex or implications of sex. So if I just kind of cycle back and forth between these two pictures, you're not listening to anything that I'm saying. So I'm going to move on. And it reacts really strongly to danger, images of danger, or the idea of danger. So if you use, food, sex, or danger in your design, you know that it's going to grab attention. Now, I'm not saying you should always do that, but I'm just saying you know that those things will definitely grab attention. And there's...
Susan, if you hear us, then we probably need to restart the screen again.
You mentioned something about choice.
Susan, we lost you for a moment, and we have to ask you to restart the screen sharing.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, let's see, you don't have my video either. Maybe I should leave the video off, do you think, Marco?
No, I think the video is pretty good.
Yeah, all right, we'll just have to turn it on now and then. Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And back?
Yes, we have the screen. Thanks.
Okay. So I want to talk about choice. And our last speaker had mentioned something about people like to make choices, and I want to talk about that for a minute. So Sheena Iyengar did some interesting research, and she would take jars of jam and jelly and do this in a grocery store. And sometimes she had a table with jars of jam, 24 jars of jam for people to come and try out. And sometimes she had a table with 6 jars of jam for people to try out. So when there were 24 jars of jam, 60% of the people coming by would stop to taste the jam. When there were 6 jars of jam, only 40% would stop to taste the jam. But here's an interesting point. When it came time to actually buy the jam, many more people purchased the jam when there were only 6 jars. When there were 24 jars of jam, 3% of the people who stopped purchased. When there were 6 jars of jam, 30% of the people who stopped to taste purchased. So even though less people came to try the jam, many more, 10 times the number, purchased. So what we know about choices is we know that people like to have choices, and this is what our last speaker alluded to. They like the idea of choices. But what we also know is that if you give them too many choices, they don't choose anything at all. So we have this interesting paradox where people like choices, but if you give them a lot of choices, they won't choose. So if you show them, a website, this is a website from an art museum, and there's all these different exhibits online that you can go look at, and it says showing 1 to 20 of 71 results. I mean, there's all these pages and pages. I haven't even gotten to the exhibit. I'm just looking at the choices. It's too many. And some of you may have heard the phrase 7 plus or minus 2, that we can deal with and remember 7 plus or minus 2 things, 5 to 9 things. Well, actually, that is a myth. That's an urban legend that's out there on the internet. This was originally talked about by a guy named Miller in 1956. He gave a paper to the American Psychological Association, and he posited this idea that we have this limit of between 5 to 9 things that we can deal with, that we can remember at a time. And it was just a theory. He actually didn't have research to support that number exactly. And since then, there's been a lot of research on this, and we know that people can really only deal with and remember 3 to 4 things. And I've just given you a couple of the research articles. There's a lot of research on this. So the number is 3 to 4. So people can only deal with and remember and make choices from 3 to 4 things. And yet, if you ask them how many different choices or options would you want, they will always say, give me everything, give me everything. And this is interesting. This goes back to the old brain, because the old brain says, if I have a lot of choices, then I will have a lot of control. If I have a lot of control, then I will survive. So that's just one of those instincts. And along with this idea is the idea that we are more motivated by fear of loss than we are by the anticipation of gain. We are more afraid of losing stuff. That will always motivate us more than the idea of gaining something. So this is one reason why, for example, we can use the idea of scarcity. We can say, oh, there's only one left, or you know, this sale ends in 30 days, and that will motivate us because we're afraid of losing the opportunity. So that's all the old brain talking there. So those kinds of things are very motivating to people. I want to switch gears again, and I want to talk about, in psychology, if any of you took psychology in school, you might remember this name, Ivan Pavlov, a Russian scientist, and he studied something that we now call classical conditioning. And interestingly, he wasn't a psychologist at all. He was a biologist. He was studying digestion in dogs. And what he found was that when there's a stimulus, then there's a response. He was working with dogs. He would give them meat to eat and then measure how much saliva they produce. And what he realized was just the sight of the meat or the smell of the meat would cause the saliva to start being produced. Stimulus is the meat, response is the saliva. Now, what could this possibly have to do with what we're talking about here? Well, it does. Hold on a minute. The next thing he found was that when there was a bell over the door, when the worker came in to give him the meat, the animal, the dog, paired up the sound of the bell with the fact that the meat was going to appear. And those two things got paired together, so that eventually all he needed was the sound of the bell or the sound of the workman's boots, and the animal would salivate. We know that we can be, in humans as well as dogs, can be easily conditioned to have a response to a certain stimulus. Well, guess what? This happens to us all the time. So every time that your phone comes up with a visual alert or comes up with a little sound, you know that you have a text message or a voicemail. And in fact, we are conditioned to particular sounds and particular visual cues. There's one sound when I have a voicemail, and maybe I've programmed a different sound when I have a text message. And try sometime to hear that sound and not reach for your phone and look at it. The same thing is true online. You know, there's a little visual notification or a sound when we get an email message. These are all conditioned responses. And conditioned responses, by the way, become strongest when they are unpredictable. You don't know when that text message is going to come in. You don't know when that voicemail is going to get left. And that makes it even more addictive. It actually has to do with dopamine, and I can't go into all of that right now, but if you want to read more about that, you can find that in my books or at my blog. So if you indeed want people to respond automatically, you want to build in these visual and audio cues. Pavlov's dogs, you have to turn off all those alerts. And then you can eventually break down that conditioning because you're not hearing the alert, you're not seeing the alert.
Susan, if you are still on the shoe slide, then it's okay. If you have moved forward, then we are still seeing the slide with shoes.
Okay, let me see what I can do here.
Yes, and a really dramatic still frame from your video. But now we see the desktop. Now we see the desktop from here. Okay.
So when
Yes.
I was talking about that, I was showing a screen with a text message.
Okay, thanks.
So we know that we become conditioned easily to unpredictable auditory and visual cues. Now, another aspect that I want to talk about of unconscious processing, and again, actually another thing that your speaker on gamification was talking about. In fact, as he was talking, I was thinking about the idea that so much of what he was talking about and so much of the impact of gamification has to do with this underlying psychology. And I know that the gamification people in the area of games have often been really interested in what I have to say about the psychology of design, because that's really what we're talking about. When you're talking about designing games and putting gamification into your design, you're talking about what really motivates people. And the two of the areas of motivation that I'm going to talk about here that have a lot to do with gamification are the need to belong, and then in a minute I'm going to talk about the desire for mastery. So we know that people have a deep need to belong, and we know that they are very influenced by what other people do and say. So some research by Latane and Darley all the way back in 1968 showed us this. They would stage scenarios on the street, and they would have someone look like that he was ill or hurt, and if one person came by and saw him, they would give help 85% of the time. But when a bunch of people came by together, they wouldn't help as often, and that's because they wouldn't know what to do. Is he hurt? Is he drunk? Is what's going on? And they would look to the people around them to see what to do. And the people around them aren't doing anything, they're not going to do anything either. We're very affected by what others do or don't do. Research by Chen looked at this in terms of online reviews and testimonials. We know that online reviews of a product, for instance, at Amazon, of a book or a product, are going to influence people greatly. It's unconscious, they can't help it, and it has to do with this need we have to belong to a group. And Chen actually tested out 3 kinds of reviews. Reviews left by people who I think are just like me, reviews left by experts on that particular product line, and reviews or recommendations from the website itself based on your previous buying habit. All 3 were influential, but the most influential was reviews left by other people who I think are just like me. So we know that this kind of thing can really affect behavior. And then we know that people have this desire for mastery. So another one I want to talk about here, and really ties into everything in terms of games, because we inherently want to learn. We inherently want to master whatever the topic is. And there are things that you can do to stimulate the desire for mastery. So your last speaker mentioned challenge. Feeling that I'm being challenged stimulates a desire for mastery. Other things that stimulate the desire for mastery are autonomy, the feeling that I have some control over what I'm doing. That will make me want to keep going, as well as giving me lots of feedback, all things that we know exist in games. But not just games. I mean, if you want people, for instance, to keep using let's say you have a language website where people are learning different languages, and you want them to keep using it, you want to give them some control over which activity they do next. If you have an online course, you want to give them some control of what order they go through the lessons. That's the autonomy part. You want to give them lots of feedback. Which lesson are you on? How many more do you have to go? So it's not just games, it's anything you're designing where you want to keep people motivated to keep going. You can stimulate that desire for mastery. So we've come to the close to the end of the presentation, almost time for questions. I just want to mention that the material that we've been talking about here is obviously in my book, Neuro Web Design, by the same name, but also a lot of the material that we've been talking about is in the new book, How to Get People to Do Stuff. The other book that I think will be of interest to this audience is 100 Things Every Designer Needs to Know About People. And I mentioned before about the free giveaway, so as I wrap up here, perhaps our moderator can pick which tweets were the best and who's going to get the free course. And for those of you who don't get the free course, I did put together, though, a coupon code called TALK, which you can use to get a special price on the Udemy course in case you don't win. I want to leave you with this idea.
We actually lost your voice, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Where did you lose it?
Yeah, now I hear you.
Okay, so creativity is allowing yourself to make mistakes. Design is knowing which ones to keep. So I know you guys are going to be creative, but and it's okay to make lots of mistakes. But I also know that you have the capacity to not just be creative, but to actually do design and to take some of these ideas that I've been talking about and think about how to incorporate them into your design so that you can create products that speak not just to the conscious mind, but also to that mid-social brain and also to the old brain, so that you can engage people more deeply. And that's the end of the presentation. So, Marco, do you want to take questions and see who won the giveaway?
Yes, I think let's take questions from audience if we have first, and then take the chance to give out 3 tickets to online trainings. And we have first question from back there. And if somebody is also wanting to ask, please sign and we'll send the microphone so you can be ready before next one is finished. Previous one is.
Hey, thank you for your talk. I have a question about the universality. Has the research, how much of the elements of what makes people click that you talked about have to be found universally adaptable, and how much is only culture specific?
Yeah, everything that I've talked about here today is universally adaptable. It turns out, I mean, there are definitely some things that are culturally specific. For instance, how people react to colors is culturally specific, and there are a few other how people react to competition is culturally dependent somewhat, but interestingly, the things that I'm talking about here, especially if we're talking about unconscious behaviors, these are really things that are have to do with how our brains work, and so in that sense, they are not as culturally dependent.
Any more questions? If there are no more questions, then we can move on to the question of finding the 3 tweeters from the duration of your presentation. And actually looking at the feed, I have looked at the activities through the day. I would very much like to present the 3 tickets to Liigaleetina. Yeah. Marco will later deal with the contacting with you. Maret Kruve and Carol Tickerby, who has been keeping everybody informed through the day. So thank you. These are the 3 names.
Great.
No,
Yeah, so if you can just get them in touch with me via email, then we can talk about how they can get access to a class.
Yes, Marco will arrange that later. Now that the tension of the cushion is down, has anybody gotten now some questions more, maybe, before we let Susan go? Yeah, there is the question from a previous presenter.
Hey, thanks. My question is, can you do any generalizations regarding in which instances to invest the motivational power more into the so-called new brain or middle brain or older brain, in addition to the factor that older brains process more simpler information? Is there anything else in there? Like, how do you choose?
Yeah, how do you decide which one to use in a particular situation? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very good question, and in the newest book, How to Get People to Do Stuff, I talk about this. I talk about actually 7 different ways to motivate people, and so here's the thing: some of these things are more powerful than others in terms of how they affect human behavior. And so you have that to take into account. So some of the 3 that I mentioned here, the need to belong, the power of stories, and the desire for mastery, are actually 3 of the those are I think the most powerful of the 7 that I talk about in the book. I think for most of the things, I mean, certainly, instincts and sex and food and fear, those are extremely powerful. But I think when we're talking about doing design, messages that are around stories, messages that are around the need to belong or stimulating that desire for mastery, are usually the 3 things, the 3 aspects to use that are powerful and also lasting. I mean, if you show a picture of a face, if you show a picture of food, if you give a message of danger, it's very powerful and it's going to grab attention, but it may not have the lasting effect that getting someone to change their self-story will have, or stimulating the desire for mastery, or tapping into that need to belong. So I think you have to look at it from a couple of angles. One is, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? And when I teach workshops on this, what we do is we walk through a pretty simple process, but basically you have to ask the question, first of all, who is my audience? Obviously, we always ask that in usability work. And what is it that's going to motivate this audience? What is this particular group of people? I can't work on an individual level. I can't design my app for one person. But if we look at the target group, what is it that's going to motivate them the most? And of the 7 drivers that I talk about in that book, I say, pick which 1 or 2 you think is going to really affect this particular audience in this particular situation. Which of the 7 is going to affect them the most? And I actually give some case studies and go through this, lots of examples in the book. So once you know, here's my audience, here's what's going to motivate them the most. Now I have chosen, which one to use. And then you can incorporate that in. So it's kind of a process of, on the one hand, deciding which of these are, in general, the most powerful, and on the other hand, thinking deeply about your particular audience and which one you think is going to work for your audience. And of course, I recommend that you actually do some exploratory research and interviews to understand the underlying psychographic of your particular target, so what's going to really resonate with some people. Some groups, again, in the particular thing that you're designing, the desire for mastery is going to be the strongest. With others, it might be the need to belong. with someone else, it might be the power of stories. And of course, you can combine some of these, but you don't want to be hitting them with all of these at once, right? You want to pick which one or two are going to be the most strongest for your audience, and then design that into your application.
Thank you. There is one more question. If the microphone can go this way, please.
Susan, I'm sorry, I'm a bit nervous about public speech.
All right, that's fine.
Thank you very much for your lectures, and you're marvelous professional. And I would like to make a mark about human brain, because everything what you are talking about, it's for me as a user. It sounds like it's like manipulation.
Yes, yes.
It's like motivating and manipulating and giving a choice. They are three different things. And being such kind of professional and organizing, giving services to users, it's quite dangerous to play games with people's brain. Manipulating. For example, when we give the choice for a kid in the morning to do what do you like to have, a porridge with orange jelly or strawberry or something like that. It's not choice. It's manipulating a kid. Or, for example, we sell products with naked female body. It's not a choice. You're manipulating with instinct, actually. So I don't know whether we are going to discuss that, but I would like to make a remark as a user that we're not going to manipulate or play with my brain, but you are going to help me to solve my problems, help me to spend less time in internet, to click less, and to get the perfect product for myself. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great comment, and thank you for bringing it up. And I have to say that the question usually comes up when I give a talk like this. And actually, in my latest book, I address it in the very first chapter, because I think it's a very big issue, and it's a very important issue. And I don't think we talk about it enough, and I don't think we have a direct answer. So the point that you're making is that these things that we're talking about are very powerful. And if we design with them, we can easily manipulate people. Now, I'm going to claim that a lot of this is not new. I speak a lot to advertising conferences, and they've been using these ideas pre-internet, right, for years and years. Print ads, right, to let's be honest, manipulate people to buy a particular product, for instance. So we have deep ethical dilemmas in our industry, and as designers, I think we are right in the middle of these ethical dilemmas, because who are we designing for? I mean, we can say on the one hand that we're designing for the users, and we want to present choices and help them and make things easy for them and serve them and help them to do what they want to do online, to buy, as you said, the best product for them on, make the best match. But how many of you is your salary being paid by the users, by the customer? I mean, probably very little. So we constantly have this dilemma in our industry, because many of us the money we make is coming not from the consumer or the customer, but...
We lost your voice, sorry.
Where did you? Can you hear me now?
No, no, I can. Yeah.
And so we are paid by the company that's trying to sell the product. So who are we working for? Who are we designing for? Are we designing for the user, or are we designing to increase the revenue of the company? It's a very, forget about these for a moment. All of these ideas about that we've been talking about here. I think in our work we have an ethical a dilemma and paradox. So, yeah, I agree. All of these ideas, on the one hand, we can just throw up our hands and say, well, we can't even use any of this because it's too manipulative. And you could say that, and I don't know that I could really argue with you about it. But on the other hand, if I was going to argue, I would say, look, we have, whether we consciously choose how we...
Sorry, we lost your voice again.
Choose whether we're going to use some of these ideas, or we don't consciously choose it, something appears on the screen, and we can either choose, and we have to think deeply about what our ethics are and what's okay with us and what we're willing to do and not do. But whether we choose what the choices are or whether we just kind of randomly put things up, there are choices. So I guess I would say I would rather us understand the psychology, and I would rather us think deeply about how to use it than to just say it's too manipulative and therefore I don't want to have anything to do with it. You are using it, when you do design, you are making decisions about what to put on the screen and how many choices to give and which choices. You are doing it. I'd rather have you do it consciously and think through the ethical implications. But you're absolutely right. There are deep ethical issues and possibility for manipulation that we have to be very careful about.
So I would actually like to connect the last questions with the last question to Edwin on the gaming side, which was related to people in gaming design bringing into the experience into the general design of services and so on. And I think the question was related to that a lot of people don't have the gaming experience to bring in design. And I think the correct answer to that question is that possibly more people need to get the gaming design experience before they are going to do the design questions of different services, so they can bring this gaming mindset into their future projects. And possibly it's also the same thing about all of these brain games, that once you know that what you are doing, when it gets some kind of actual background, you are knowing that you are possibly manipulating, possibly directing people, then you can do it consciously, and it isn't just some seldom examples like using naked ladies and cat pictures everywhere to sell everything. There is actually tons of tricks that you can do. And I was giving a speech last year, and somebody asked me about a project or campaign to teach everybody in Estonia, all kids, to program. And it's supposedly scientific evidence that not everybody's brain is tuned to solve the algorithmic problems. And I think this is probably something like, if it was 30 or more % who actually could be effectively programming. And I said that based on that evidence, I don't like the idea of teaching everybody to program. I think people should be taught completely different things. And they said, oh, okay, what do you think we should teach every kid in the school then, if we are not teaching them to program? I had like 5 seconds to consider an answer, and I said, magics. I think what you are telling is very well connected to the question of also how the magicians work. And how the magicians work, you're thinking they are in the circus. No, they are also selling you cars, and they are selling you other kinds of stuff. If everybody would have more information about how your brain is tricked, they could, from one side, of course, use it more in their design. but they would be also more knowing that, okay, in this case I'm tricked like that. Okay, I try to be a bit more calm in this side. So, but Edwin wants to.
Thanks. I completely agree with what you said. Awareness of the factors that influence our choice is our best option to raise above the factors. So the more people know it in the long run, actually, the better. But I also wanted to mention that, for me, one of the key questions in motivation psychology and motivating other people, the ethical part of it. And I would just like to say that to really answer the question, we need to look at the context. Why you are here today. You're here today because you serve some motives. You're here to fill your wishes. We all want to fill our wishes, and we can do this only with the help of other people. Now, when I am across the table from you and asking for salt, I'm using the system called politeness, which obliges other consciousnesses to use their body to fill my desire. I desire salt, so please give it to me, and you do it, and it's voluntary. So what I'm trying to say is we partake in each other's actions, and there's no escape from it. We can do it either consciously or unconsciously, but we can't isolate our own responsibility in being in interaction with our other people. Even if we're sitting in a cave and doing nothing, then we still carry the responsibility that there are people out there that we could help and would need our help if we wanted to do this. There's always an alternative to be a better person and to help and to be more ethical. So ultimately, each of us needs to decide, am I in the process of taking or sharing equally or giving? And look at their own motives and to understand the motive that is driving my actions right now. Is it essentially connected with me getting something, or me sharing something, or me giving something? So totally three different directions of ethicalness and the basis for my motives. And if I'm aware of that it's there, and I have no escape from that choice, then I'm able to choose giving instead of taking. So that is actually, I think that's the essence of motivation psychology. That there's no escape from using other people's bodies for our own desires. There's no escape because we live together. And the coolest part is consciousnesses are actually phenomena which get to use more than one body. And it is only manipulative if you do it with the wrong motives, basically, or if you do it, if you try to conceal it. But if you bring it out, or if you use it as a tool for commonly accepted goals, for example, to make an experience more pleasurable, just as a goal itself, then I don't think it's manipulation. It's just taking part of of life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And does Susan want to add last word to that, or just?
I will add one last thing, which is one comment that was made was that the more you know about all of this, then the more aware you'll be, and the less you'll be prone to the effects. And I'm not sure that's true. So unfortunately, as much as I know about this whole field, I'm sure that I'm just as affected as everyone else at the messages. So it's a good thought that maybe the more aware we are, the more we're protected.
Sorry, we lost your voice now.
Oh, okay. Well, excellent discussion, and I really appreciate being part of your conference.
Okay, thank you, and applause to Susan.
Thank you.